He was born blind, as all puppies are, in the damp corner of an abandoned barn where his mother had sought refuge from the unseasonable April storm. Third in a litter of 7, he entered the world fighting, smaller than the others, struggling harder for milk, for warmth, for life itself. His mother, a golden retriever mix with haunted eyes and prominent ribs beneath her dull coat, cleaned him with particular attention, as if recognizing in his desperate squirming a kindred spirit determined to survive against unfavorable odds. The farm had been vacant for years, its fields overrun with wild grasses that whispered secrets to the wind. Rain leaked through the barn's weathered roof, creating rhythmic pools on the dirt floor. When lightning flashed, it illuminated the skeletal wooden beams overhead like the ribcage of some great, dying beast. By 3 weeks, when his eyes finally opened to the world, he revealed irises of striking amber, unusual against his predominantly black coat with its single white patch shaped like a crescent moon on his chest. His siblings tumbled and played in the scattered hay, but he watched, observed, learned the patterns of light that filtered through the barn slats, marking the passage of days, recognized the warning in his mother's low growl when strangers approached, understood that the world beyond their haven contained both wonders and dangers in measures yet unknown. The farmer discovered them in early June. The man's weathered face, etched with lines like the furrows of his long-neglected fields, registered first surprise, then resignation, as he counted the puppies now scrambling behind their wary mother. "Well now," he said, voice rough from disuse, "what am I supposed to do with you lot?" He brought food the next day, proper dog food, not the field mice and scraps their mother had been subsisting on. The puppies fell upon it ravenously, while their mother maintained a cautious distance. The amber-eyed pup, more hesitant than his siblings, watched the farmer's hands, the way they moved slowly, deliberately, the intuitive understanding already forming in his young mind that hands could bring both pain and comfort. Within a week, a battered pickup truck arrived, and strangers departed with 2 of his siblings, then 3 more the following week, until only he and his smallest sister remained, curled together for warmth during the increasingly uncomfortable visits from the farmer, who peered down at them with growing irritation. "Last ones," he muttered one morning in July, the barn air heavy with summer heat. "Can't keep feeding strays." The pup's mother seemed to sense the shift, her eyes tracking the farmer's movements with new intensity. That night, she moved them, carrying each puppy by the scruff through the high grass under the cover of darkness. The amber-eyed pup sensed her fear, her determination, and remained silent despite the discomfort of being carried like prey. They traveled for what seemed an eternity, finally settling in a hollow beneath an overturned tree by a stream where the water ran cool and clear. For 2 days, they lived in this strange new world of rushing water and rustling leaves. The puppies ventured further from their mother, exploring with growing confidence. His sister, smaller but more daring, led these expeditions, her white-tipped tail wagging as she discovered a beetle or an interesting stone. He followed more cautiously, his senses already sharper, already attuned to the subtle warnings that preceded danger. The car appeared on the 3rd day, tires crunching on the gravel road that wound through the woods 100 yards from their den. Children's voices pierced the forest quiet. Their mother's ears pricked forward, her body tense. She barked once, a warning the pups had never heard before, and darted toward the sound. She never returned. Night fell. The temperature dropped. The 2 puppies huddled together, whimpering occasionally, waiting for the warm, familiar scent of their mother. By morning, his sister had grown weak, her small body trembling against his. The amber-eyed pup nosed her gently, then set out with instinct as his only guide. He returned with half a sandwich abandoned at a nearby picnic area, dropping it before his sister, who barely had the strength to eat. For 3 days, he scavenged what he could, discarded food, a dead squirrel, whatever might keep them alive. But his sister weakened steadily, and on the 4th dawn, she no longer stirred when he nudged her awake. He stayed beside her motionless body until sunset, confused by the stillness, the growing coldness, the subtle shift in scent that signaled a fundamental change his young mind couldn't yet comprehend. Only hunger finally drove him away, alone now in a world that seemed suddenly vast and indifferent. Autumn arrived. The golden retriever mix with amber eyes, no longer a pup but not yet fully grown, had learned to hunt for himself, to fight when necessary, to avoid humans whose intentions he could now read in the set of their shoulders or the tension in their hands. He'd grown lean and wary, his once shiny coat now often matted with burrs and dirt. The white crescent on his chest remained his most distinctive feature, visible even through the grime, a beacon in the darkness when he moved through the forest at night. He followed the creek downstream, instinctively seeking wider waters, more plentiful food sources. The rural landscape gradually gave way to scattered houses, then developments, then the outskirts of a small town where garbage cans yielded more reliable meals than hunting. He slept beneath porches, in drainage ditches, once in an abandoned car with its windows broken out. A woman with silver-streaked hair put out water for him behind the small library where she worked. She never approached him, never called or cajoled, simply filled the bowl each morning and cleared away whatever scraps of food he'd managed to find. Sometimes she left a tennis ball nearby. He never touched it, but he watched from the shadows as it sat in the gravel lot, bright green against the gray. One Tuesday in late October, the woman arrived with something that smelled like heaven. Real meat, cooked but still warm, releasing tendrils of scent that made his stomach constrict painfully. She placed it beside the water bowl and, for the first time, sat down on the library's back step instead of returning inside. Hunger and caution waged war within him. He circled the building twice, approaching from different angles, testing the air for deception. The woman remained motionless, her gaze directed away from him, her hands visible in her lap. Finally, he crept forward, every muscle tensed for quick retreat. The food was chicken, warm, tender, seasoned with herbs that exploded across his tongue. He devoured it in seconds, then crept closer, drawn by some inexplicable force to this human who seemed to understand his fear. "There now," she said, her voice as gentle as the autumn breeze that stirred the fallen leaves around them. "You've had a rough time of it, haven't you?" She moved slowly, reaching into her pocket to produce more chicken. This time she held it out, her arm extended fully, her body still. He hesitated, then took a single step forward, then another. Her scent reached him, books and lavender, and something uniquely her own that registered as neither threat nor deception. The chicken disappeared from her fingers without his muzzle making contact with her skin, a calculated distance maintained even in this moment of connection. She didn't push for more, but the next day he was waiting when her car pulled into the lot, and the distance between them shortened by inches. It took 3 weeks before she could touch him. A single brief contact of fingers against his coarse fur that sent him skittering backward, confused by the surge of memory it triggered. His mother's tongue smoothing his puppy coat, his sister's warm body curled against his own. Forgotten sensations of comfort and connection that his body remembered even as circumstances had forced his mind to abandon them. The woman, whose name he came to understand was Margaret, never tried to bring him inside, never attempted to collar or contain him. They existed in a careful balance, she providing regular meals and quiet companionship on the library steps, he gradually allowing longer contact, brief moments of ordinary canine pleasure as her fingers found the itchy spots behind his ears or along his spine. December brought snow and bitter cold. Margaret began arriving earlier, leaving later, her concern evident in the extra food she provided, the heavy blanket she left in the sheltered corner by the heating vent. Still, he refused to follow when she opened the library door in invitation, some deep-rooted wariness preventing complete surrender to domesticity, until the night of the great storm. The snow began mid-afternoon, fat flakes quickly accumulating, muffling the town in a blanket of eerie silence. Margaret left early, casting worried glances his way as she cleaned ice from her windshield. The dog retreated to his blanket, curling tight against the building's warmth as the snow piled higher, the temperature plummeting as darkness fell. By midnight, even the heating vent couldn't combat the bone-deep cold that penetrated his thin frame. The wind drove icy particles through his fur, and his paws burned with frostbite. Sometime near dawn, disoriented and hypothermic, he struggled to his feet and began moving, following the memory of scent through the blinding snow. Margaret's cottage stood at the end of a winding lane, its windows illuminated even at this early hour. The dog collapsed on her porch, no longer possessing the strength to retreat when the door opened, when gentle hands lifted his half-frozen body, when warmth and light enveloped him. He remembered little of the next days, only fragmented sensations of soft towels, warm broth spooned carefully into his mouth, the comfort of a real bed beside a crackling fire, and Margaret's voice, a constant presence, sometimes reading aloud from the books she brought home, sometimes simply reassuring him in the darkness when nightmares caused him to whimper and thrash. "You're safe now, Apollo," she said, the name she'd chosen for him seeming to settle into his consciousness, becoming part of his identity. "You're home." And so he was. Spring surrendered to summer, summer mellowed into autumn, and Apollo blossomed in Margaret's care. His coat grew thick and lustrous, the rich black gleaming with health, the crescent on his chest a perfect alabaster contrast. His eyes, those unusual amber orbs that had first caught Margaret's attention, glowed with intelligence and increasingly joy. The library became his second home. Margaret fashioned a special bed behind the checkout desk, and Apollo learned the rhythms of quiet study, the rustle of turning pages, the whispered conversations. Children would sit cross-legged on the floor beside him during story hour, sometimes reading haltingly to him from picture books, their small hands gentle on his fur. Margaret discovered his remarkable sensitivity one rainy Tuesday when a young boy with autism, overwhelmed by a change in routine, began rocking and keening in distress. Before anyone could intervene, Apollo quietly rose from his bed and placed himself beside the child, leaning his substantial weight gently against the boy's side. The pressure and warmth gradually calmed the storm, the boy's fingers eventually finding and clutching Apollo's fur like a lifeline in rough seas. "He always knows," the boy's mother told Margaret later, tears standing in her eyes. "Somehow, he always knows exactly what each person needs." It became a pattern. The elderly man grieving his wife of 60 years, who found silent companionship at his feet during long afternoons with poetry books. The teenage girl whose sleeves couldn't quite hide the self-inflicted scars, who would whisper her darkest thoughts into Apollo's ear while he listened with infinite patience. The combat veteran whose hands stopped shaking when they buried themselves in black fur. At home, Apollo and Margaret settled into comfortable routines. Morning walks along the river path, evening games of fetch in the fenced backyard that Margaret had installed specifically for him, nights by the fire, his head heavy on her lap as she read, occasionally pausing to share her thoughts on a particularly moving passage. "Listen to this, Apollo," she would say. "We need another and a wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear." Apollo would raise his head, meeting her eyes with that particular intensity that sometimes made Margaret wonder what ancient wisdom lurked behind his gaze. 3 years passed in this gentle harmony. Apollo approached middle age with dignity, a few silver hairs appearing around his muzzle, a slight stiffening in his joints after particularly long walks. Margaret, too, showed signs of time's passage, more silver threading through her hair, deeper lines etched around her eyes and mouth. They accommodated each other's changing needs with the wordless understanding of beings whose lives had become inextricably entwined. In their 4th winter together, Margaret developed a cough that wouldn't subside. Apollo noticed first the subtle change in her scent, something sharp and wrong beneath her familiar lavender. Then came the fatigue, the breathlessness after even short walks. The nights when pain kept her awake despite the medications that multiplied on her bedside table. Apollo never left her side during those dark months. He accompanied her to medical appointments, waiting with unnatural stillness in waiting rooms where exceptions were made for the library dog. When she could no longer manage the stairs to her bedroom, he kept vigil beside the hospital bed that appeared in the living room, alert to her every need, anticipating pain spikes before she herself was conscious of them. "Lung cancer," she explained to him one evening, her fingers tracing the outline of his ears. "Stage 4. I should have stopped smoking decades ago, I suppose." Apollo placed his head on her chest, careful to avoid the sore spots, his heartbeat steady against her increasingly fragile form. He had known, in the wordless way of creatures attuned to life's fundamental rhythms, that something irreversible had been set in motion. He could smell the disease consuming her from within, could sense the gradual withdrawal of her essential vitality. The library patrons organized a rotation, ensuring Margaret was never alone during the day while Apollo maintained his night watch. They brought food neither Margaret nor Apollo could eat. Flowers that Apollo could smell were imported from climates far from their own, an endless, well-intentioned chatter that exhausted Margaret, though she never complained. "It's just you and me who understand about silence, isn't it?" she whispered to Apollo late one night, the morphine making her words slightly slurred. The power of simply being present. April arrived, the world outside renewing itself with indifferent beauty while inside the cottage. Life ebbed away by increments. Apollo found himself torn between his vigil and an increasing restlessness, some primal instinct urging him to move, to run, to howl his grief into the spring night. The hospice nurse, a kind woman who always greeted Apollo by name and brought him special treats, began coming daily, then twice daily. Her scent carried foreknowledge, a sorrowful anticipation that Apollo recognized and resented. On the night the cherry trees in Margaret's garden burst into bloom, she asked to be moved to the porch swing. Apollo followed as two nurses carefully transferred her, noting the almost translucent quality of her skin, the labored rise and fall of her chest. She weighed nothing now, this human who had been his anchor, his safe harbor. "Look, Apollo," she said, gesturing weakly toward the moonlit blossoms. "One last spring." He placed his head in her lap, feeling the butterfly touch of her fingers on his fur. They sat together as night deepened around them, as Margaret's breathing grew increasingly shallow, as the space between each inhale lengthened. "You'll be all right," she told him, her voice barely a whisper. "Sarah from the library will take you. I've arranged everything, but you have to promise me something." Apollo raised his head, meeting her gaze directly, the communication between them transcending any need for human language. "Keep helping them, the lost ones, the broken ones, like we found each other." Near dawn, with the first birdsong filtering through the cherry blossoms, Margaret took her final breath. Apollo remained motionless for long minutes, his muzzle resting against her still hand, absorbing the knowledge that the essential spark had fled, leaving only the fragile vessel behind. Then he threw back his head and released a sound he had never made before. Not quite a howl, not quite a lament, but something ancient and profound that echoed through the morning stillness. A sound that carried both grief and gratitude, an acknowledgement of love and loss, and the unbreakable bond between two souls who had healed each other. The town mourned Margaret collectively, but none more deeply than Apollo. He moved through the following days in a fog of confusion and grief, unable to understand why he'd been relocated to Sarah's apartment above the bookstore, why Margaret's scent grew fainter on the few possessions that had accompanied him. Sarah was kind, accommodating, careful not to disrupt the rituals that provided Apollo his only stability. Morning walks followed the same river path. His library bed remained in its place behind the circulation desk. The children still read to him during story hour, though now their small hands sometimes wiped away tears when they noticed his subdued demeanor. "He misses her," they whispered to their parents. "He's heartbroken." Weeks passed. Apollo ate little, slept fitfully, and performed his duties at the library with mechanical precision rather than his former enthusiasm. Only with the most vulnerable patrons did glimpses of his old self emerge. A combat veteran having a particularly bad day, a child overwhelmed by noise or change, the elderly seeking connection. In these moments, Apollo would rouse himself from grief to provide comfort, as if honoring the promise Margaret had extracted during their final hours together. Summer arrived, unusually hot and dry. Apollo developed a slight limp that Sarah attributed to age and grief. The local vet prescribed anti-inflammatories and suggested reducing his walks, but Apollo resisted any further disruption to routines that connected him to Margaret. On a sweltering August afternoon, a young woman entered the library, her face tear-streaked, her body language radiating distress. Apollo, dozing in his bed, immediately raised his head, nostrils flaring to catch her scent, the sharp tang of fear, the heaviness of despair. He rose and approached as she sank into a chair in the most isolated corner of the reading room. For over an hour, he simply lay at her feet, occasionally pressing his head against her knee when her breathing became erratic. Eventually, her hand descended, fingers tangling in his fur. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, so softly that only Apollo could hear. "I can't go back there. He'll kill me this time." Apollo gazed up at her, recognizing in her expression the same hunted wariness he had once carried. She continued speaking, the words pouring out as if the simple act of directing them at this silent, non-judgmental creature provided catharsis denied in human interaction. The woman, Emily, had fled an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes on her back and a half-empty wallet. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to in this small town where she'd hoped to disappear. Sarah found them there at closing time, Apollo's head resting protectively on the woman's lap. "I'm sorry," Emily said, hastily gathering her few possessions. "I lost track of time." "It's all right," Sarah replied, noting the dog's unusual attentiveness. "Apollo seems to have taken a special interest in you." That night, Emily slept on Sarah's sofa. Apollo positioned squarely between her and the door, his protective instincts fully roused for the first time since Margaret's passing. In the darkness before dawn, when nightmares jolted Emily awake, it was Apollo who pressed close, offering silent solidarity until her breathing steadied. "He understands somehow," Emily told Sarah over coffee the next morning. "It's like he knows exactly what I'm going through." Sarah nodded, watching Apollo track Emily's movements with unusual intensity. Margaret used to say he was an old soul, that he'd seen enough suffering to recognize it in others. The shelter found Emily a placement the following day, a transitional apartment in a secure building across town. As she prepared to leave, Apollo grew increasingly agitated, pacing and whining, behavior so uncharacteristic that Sarah grew concerned. "I think he's worried about you," she told Emily. "He doesn't usually get this attached so quickly." Emily knelt, taking Apollo's face between her hands. "I'll be okay," she promised. "I'm going somewhere safe now." But Apollo remained unconvinced. That night, he refused food, ignored Sarah's attempts at comfort, and stationed himself by the apartment door with a determination that bordered on obsession. Shortly before midnight, Sarah was awakened by frantic barking, another unprecedented behavior from the normally composed dog. "What is it, boy?" she asked, following as Apollo led her to the window overlooking the street. A police cruiser sat below, lights flashing silently. As Sarah watched, 2 officers escorted a handcuffed man to the vehicle. Even from a distance, Apollo's reaction, a low, continuous growl, confirmed what Sarah somehow already knew. This was the threat Emily had fled. The next morning brought news. Emily's ex-boyfriend had tracked her to the shelter, armed and intent on fulfilling his lethal promises. He had been apprehended only because an anonymous caller reported suspicious activity, a man testing window locks, peering into units. "It was Apollo," Sarah insisted to the bewildered police officer taking her statement. Somehow, he knew Emily was in danger. The autumn that followed brought seismic shifts to their small community. Emily, grateful and increasingly confident, volunteered at the library alongside Sarah. Apollo, restored to purpose by her presence, regained some of his former vitality. His limp persisted, occasionally worsening after particularly active days, but his eyes regained their amber spark. The first snow fell on Margaret's birthday, large flakes transforming the town into a scene from a snow globe. Apollo stood at the window of Sarah's apartment, watching the transformation with quiet intensity, something stirring in his aging bones, memory, perhaps, or premonition. That night, he dreamed of Margaret, not as she had been in her final days, but vital and laughing, calling his name as she tossed a tennis ball across sun-dappled grass. He woke feeling strangely unsettled, a restlessness pervading his normally serene demeanor. The following week, as Sarah and Emily decorated the library for the holiday season, Apollo began following a pattern only he understood. He visited each of his special humans, the autistic boy who now read independently but still saved time each visit to sit with Apollo, the combat veteran who had recently begun volunteering with service dog training, the teenage girl whose sleeves now revealed healing skin rather than fresh wounds. To each, he offered extended moments of connection, as if imparting some wordless wisdom. "It's like he's saying goodbye," Emily observed to Sarah as they watched Apollo rest his head for long minutes on the lap of an elderly patron who had recently lost her husband. Sarah dismissed the notion, but a seed of worry took root. That evening, she scheduled a veterinary appointment, concerned that Apollo's increased attentiveness might be masking pain or illness. The December night before the appointment, snow fell again, transforming the town into a wonderland of hushed white. Apollo grew increasingly restless as evening deepened, pacing between the window and the door, his behavior reminiscent of the night he had sensed Emily's danger. "What's wrong, boy?" Sarah asked, checking the street below for any disturbance. Apollo whined, pawing at the door with unprecedented urgency. Sarah hesitated, then reached for his leash. "Okay, just a quick walk to settle you down." The moment the apartment door opened, Apollo bolted. Not his usual dignified trot, but a full sprint that caught Sarah off guard, the leash tearing from her grasp. She called after him, but he disappeared into the swirling snow, a dark shape quickly swallowed by the winter night. Sarah and Emily searched for hours, joined by library patrons and community members who had come to love the black dog with the white crescent. They called his name into the silent streets, checked his favorite spots along the river path, scoured the library grounds where he had first connected with Margaret. It was the combat veteran who found him, guided by some instinct of his own to the small cemetery on the town's outskirts. There, atop Margaret's snow-covered grave, Apollo lay curled as if sleeping, the white crescent on his chest nearly indistinguishable from the snow beneath him. His body was still warm when they reached him, but the essential spark, the soul that had recognized and responded to human suffering with such extraordinary empathy, had already departed. Like Margaret on her final night, Apollo had chosen his time, had made his farewells in his own way, had completed the circle that began in abandonment and ended in purposeful love. They buried him beside Margaret, beneath the flowering cherry tree that marked her resting place. The entire town attended the small ceremony, sharing stories of Apollo's quiet impact on their lives. The autistic boy placed a tennis ball on the fresh earth. The teenage girl, her arms now bearing tattoos of healing rather than scars of pain, left a handwritten poem. The veteran stood at attention and offered a formal salute. As twilight descended, Emily lingered after the others had departed, Sarah waiting patiently nearby. "I don't understand," Emily said finally. "Why leave Sarah? Why come here to the end?" Sarah smiled through her tears, remembering Margaret's words on that last night. Because some bonds transcend separation, because love doesn't end when breath does. In the years that followed, Apollo's legacy continued through the people whose lives he had touched. The library established a therapy dog program in his honor. The veteran founded a service animal training center for fellow PTSD sufferers. Emily, having found her voice and her courage, became an advocate for domestic violence survivors. And on quiet nights when snow fell thick and silent, those walking past the small cemetery sometimes reported seeing a black dog with a white crescent on his chest, trotting purposefully along the paths, head held high, amber eyes alert. still watching over the broken and the healing, still fulfilling the promise made to the woman who had saved him, whom he had in turn saved, in love's perfect symmetry.